Welcome, everyone. I'm Rebecca Snyder, Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association, and I am delighted to have here for Objectivity and Reporting Larry Nagengast and Mike Preston and Daniel Oyefusi from the Baltimore Sun. Larry, do you want to do our introductions?
Yes, okay, thank you very much. We are running a program here. It's co-sponsored by Delaware Community Foundation with its summer journalism internship program and the Delaware DC Press Association. Presenting, as Rebecca noted, are two staff members from the Baltimore Sun, columnist Mike Preston and reporter Daniel Oyefusi. Many of you probably know them from their coverage of the Baltimore Ravens, and they've been one of the strongest franchises in the NFL for at least a dozen years, and that I suspect creates plenty of challenges in remaining objective. We've all heard the lyrics from "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." We know that natural tendency to root for the home team. Objectivity can be a challenge, especially as the reporters get to know the athletes for more than what they do on the playing field. And, you'll find out this in other types of reporting too, that as you get to know your sources, you'll chat about their families, learn that you may have gone to the same colleges, and maybe some of these sources are going to try to pick up your tab for lunch or, and where do you go to develop, drawing that line between the business relationships and friendship. Near the end of the session, we'll have like a 30-second timeout, and then we'll go into questions from our listeners. If you've got something that you want to ask in the meantime, put your notes up in the chat field, and we'll do our best to pick that up. That's it from me. Mike and Daniel, you've got the ball. Go ahead.
Daniel, you got the ball.
Hand off.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you for organizing this this event. I think it's really cool to kind of talk about this topic. I know objectivity in journalism has been something that is always discussed, but especially in the past year, given the protests we've seen, the election and whatnot. But it's also kind of interesting to kind of flip it on its side and look at it from a sports aspect. So just a quick background for those who don't know, I'm from the area. I grew up in Towson, Maryland. I went to the University of Maryland. So, I grew up watching the Ravens and rooting for them in a sense. But, as I've kind of transitioned into this professional role where I'm now covering them, I've kind of had to rewire kind of my brain in the way that I work. Obviously I can't root for the team in the press box. I can't write with the non-objective lens. So like I said, it's kind of a rewiring in a sense. And I guess I might have to thank my dad, because when I was growing up, he always told me, like, don't get too attached, because it's not like you work for the team or they don't pay your bills or anything like that. But it's really important because it's all fun and games. It's a sport, but at the end of the day, we're still doing a job in reporting on this team and letting fans and letting readers know like the inside look at this team. So it's important not to to be objective and to not be kind of skewed and biased, because as soon as you allow that to happen, that's the minute that you let it impact your writing and impact your reporting, and then you're not doing the best job that you can. And even Larry, you were mentioning sources wanting to pick up your tabs and stuff like that, and maybe players or coaches reaching out for favors or whatnot. It's funny you mentioned that, because a couple weeks or months ago, I had a family member of a Ravens player reach out to me and invite me to a family gathering. We had connected through something I had written and whatnot, and really nice lady. I love speaking to her, but obviously I had to, politely decline just because of the conflict of interest and stuff like that. So, Mike can kind of speak a little differently because he's a columnist, so he's kind of allowed to have an opinion. Me, I try my best not to go deep into those waters as much. On social media, I might give a quick opinion or just kind of thought on something that I saw on the field or whatnot. But overall, I try to stick to just reporting as it is, and kind of fill that role. Everyone has an opinion at the end of the day, but what's that worth? I know Mike will probably take offense to that because he's a columnist, but everyone has opinions. But me, I kind of look at it, my job is to let you know what's going on, hit all sides of everything, question what what coaches and players say, because, you know, like politicians, you know, coaches and athletes and front office members, they'll lie to you as well. So it's really to question what they're saying and to give the truth.
All yours, Mike.
All right. Yeah, Daniel, we all have an opinion. It's all good stuff. I'm Mike Preston. I've been at the Sun for 38 years. 21 as a columnist and 17 as a reporter / feature writer / beat writer. And during those first 17 years, I had to be objective, and there's a difference between the two. Reporters are more objective. And when I was in that role, you just present the facts. You wrote your features, but when it came to news stories, you wrote the facts, you made it balanced. You gave everyone a chance to say what they wanted to say. Now, as a columnist, I'm subjective. I really don't care what anybody else thinks. I have to give my, what I try to do is I want to get an emotion out of you. I want to make you happy. I want to make you sad. Some days I want to make you cry. I want to make you call me on the telephone and leave me nasty messages. I want you to send me those emails. That's the way you develop a following. And with me, I've never been the type to really care what other people think, because you can't succeed and be a columnist that way. You just have to believe in what you write, stay with it because it is your opinion. And even though others disagree, that's life, because this is your job. This is what you do. You give opinions. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean you can't be fair and balanced, because if you write too much negative stuff, people won't read you. If you write too much positive stuff, people say you're a homer. So somewhere you kind of got to be in the middle of the road, but still stay with what you believe. And every once in a while, you got to throw your readers a curveball. When the Ravens, if they get blown out and everyone thinks, oh, he's going to kill him the next day, he's going to have him the next day. And then you find that little nugget of light there and you write about it and say, this is what's going on. They're going to be pretty good at this. That totally throws them off. All right. And then sometimes, you know, depending on the circumstances, you can always go the opposite way and find something positive, find something negative, but you don't want to pigeonhole yourself where you're always saying, he's so negative, he's so positive, but always believe in what you write. Have a firm belief in that, and you always got to back it up, because anybody can spit out opinions, but can you back it up? Now, when I was the beat writer, I covered this beat probably different than Daniel did, because the times have changed. When I went in the locker room and I was about 34, 35, I was still at that age where I got along with players very well because I played the game. I could go in the locker room and I could sit around and joke with players. I could lie with players. I could bust on them. I kind of fit in, you know. I kind of dressed a little bit like them, because you don't want to be singled out and say, oh, there's the reporter. You just want to kind of blend in. Now, Daniel talked about how someone they invited him to a family gathering. He didn't go. I would have went to that, because being a good reporter is about building relationships. All right. And that doesn't mean you have to go to the nightclub with them. That doesn't mean you have to go to the bar with them or to dance with them. But hey, if you want to go over and establish a relationship, and especially if it's your quarterback, Lamar Jackson wants to invite me over his house. And,
no, it wasn't Lamar.
I'm going to go to Lamar Jackson's house. I am. And I'm going to hang out, and I'm going to try to cultivate that and develop that relationship and build on that, because if you want to be a good beat writer, you have to build relationships. Now, you talk about being objective. You still have to be objective, but you need to build relationships so that when things happen, people want to tell you stuff. I think the key to being a good reporter, one, is to be a great listener. All right, you have to be a great listener. You have to shut up sometimes and just absorb what other people are saying. To always ask why. I had a guy, Mark Hyman, who used to be at the Baltimore Sun. I thought was the best investigative reporter we ever had. He always asked why. Whenever he got a response, why did this happen? You get the explanation of what happened. You keep that in the back of your mind, and it always keeps the person who's telling you stuff on your toes. And then if you build those relationships, people want to tell you stuff. That's how you get information. So if you do those three things, you'd be pretty good at this job and be a pretty good reporter. But myself, I was just at that age where I kind of fit in. It doesn't work anymore. I'm to be some of these guys' fathers. So when I go in and maybe 30 years ago, I talked about the Beatles, they knew it was a singing group and some insects. They don't know anything about the Beatles now. Another thing for a columnist is if you write about tough issues, you take people on, you better show up. Because it's all about respect. If the players respect you, the coaches respect you, you will have your problems, you will have your confrontations, regardless if you're the beat guy, regardless if you're a columnist. If you're doing your job well and you don't have confrontation in all of those years, then you're probably not doing your job as well as you think. Because somewhere along the lines, you're going to bump heads. But if they respect you, they just say, hey, he's just doing his job, I'm doing my job, and you move on. That's the way it works. It's a great profession. For you young people out there, they tell you, newspapers are dying, this and that. There's always going to be a need for great writers, always. Whether it's books, internet, news, whatever, magazines, there's always going to be a need for great writers. If that's what you want to do, go get it. Go for it. And don't let anybody tell you what you can't do, because it's so much easier to tell people what they can't do. But hey, you got to persevere and get through this. So with that said, I don't want to go into my preaching mode, but that's my preaching, my
one of the things that came to mind, I was thinking about this last night, and again, in terms of objectivity and knowing the players. A couple of years ago with the Ravens, Ray Rice and the whole episode that he had with the assault on I guess it was his wife at the hotel in Atlantic City. He wound up being dropped from the team. What was like? Obviously you guys knew, or at least you did, Mike. You must have gotten to know Ray pretty well over the years. I mean, how did you go about reporting and writing about that issue when you're dealing with somebody who obviously you knew more than for just what he did on the field?
Well, I'll take you further back. I'll take you to Ray Lewis.
Okay.
And what happened in Atlanta. And I had an excellent relationship with Ray because I was the beat writer then. As the kind of guy I used to kind of hang out with him a little bit. That if you're going to get the news or the story out of this thing, you're going to get it early. Because by the time it festers and goes on for a couple of days, those guys are going to start shutting down. They're not going to talk to you anymore because they've been advised by their lawyers. And the thing is if they really understand, they know what you're doing, they'll give you the nugget. They will give you the nugget before the story comes out to let you go along with it. But after a while, they'll shut you down. But with Ray, I remember when he came back, I went over and I talked to him and we understood each other. And he just said, hey, your job, now I'm going to go do mine. And he went on to become the MVP, Defensive Player of the Year. Ray Rice never got back on the field. And you kind of feel bad about that. I didn't know him as well as I knew Ray Lewis, but he was a good guy, a quality person, but apparently had some problems off the field with his wife and maybe possibly alcohol. And that's not a good combination. But regardless, you still got to do your job. That's what you get paid to do, is write the news. Break the news, be first. That's what we get up and strive for each day. And that's what we do.
Right. Did you run into problems with other, like other guys in the in the locker room, other players in the locker room? The people standing up for Ray Lewis, for Ray Rice, and any sort of factionalism within the locker room, and that impacting your relationships.
No, because these guys understood that I was there every day.
Okay.
I knew them. I built those relationships. They knew I wasn't going to make up stuff. Again, that's what I'm talking about, where you got to build those relationships. You got to have that respect in the locker room. You got to have that respect in the front office. So they knew there wasn't going to be any fabrication. My byline was on that story. It was going to be factual. And that takes years to build. Daniel hasn't been doing it that long, but he's made those inroads. It takes years to do that. And you have that credibility, and it carries on for a while. But no, I never had any problems with any of the players. I mean, I had problems with players in other situations, but not in those two particular situations.
Okay, thank you.
Daniel, could you talk a little bit about how how you are building those relationships and sort of how you're crafting it as a early in career journalist?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's definitely a process, and like Mike said, it takes years. Before I started this position in August 2019, a couple weeks before the season started, and I talked to so many people before I took on the job, and I just kind of got the understanding that I wasn't going to be like Adam Schefter or Woj or even like the people who have I work alongside that have been here for 20 years or 15 years covering the team. So I think a lot of it is, like Mike said, just being in the locker room, talking to those guys, showing your face, being present, being fair and honest. 'Cause I think they respect that. Like Mike said, you might have to ask the tough question to John Harbaugh or Lamar Jackson or whoever it may be on the team, but they'll respect that. And like I said, it's just continuously talking to them, and not necessarily always. You have a job to do, but being authentic with them in everything that you in all conversations and all interaction that you have, and over time you're able to develop that trust. I think that it's been a little more difficult for me in the past year because we've had the pandemic. So we spent the 2020 season without any locker room access. So all the veteran reporters who have been there for 10 years, they can already rely on the guys who they've always known. And I didn't necessarily have that locker room access. The combine is usually so great in the off season for agents and front office people and coaches and whoever else may be there to come in for you to get contacts and exchange numbers and stuff like that. We didn't have that. So it's been a little tougher, but like I said, I think that I've done pretty well with the means over the past 2 seasons, just interacting with guys and forming that connection.
Do you have that makes total sense. I'm just thinking also, like with the Ravens, not being a football person myself, but like there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. Like it's like all inducing sometimes, like those big franchises and whatnot. Do you ever get sort of like, oh my gosh, I'm like here, and how do you stop that from like leaking in to you sort of that subtext, that sort of subtle bias? Do you ever feel like you have to guard against that just because you're overwhelmed by the spectacle of professional sports?
I mean, truthfully, the first season, there was a couple times where I'd be like, "Oh, I'm actually here. Like, I'm actually doing this." Because I always tell people it's not something I imagine being able to. I never imagined being in this position straight out of college. Um, I don't think it's ever like seeped into my coverage. I think it's more of just remaining in the moment. And like I say, when you got these print deadlines and you've got editors banging on your door, so to speak, to file a story, I mean, it quickly wears off, and you get put back in reality, and you're just focusing on the task at hand. So I think that I've done pretty well with that. I still see it as a surreal experience because, like I said, I grew up watching the team, and then I remember the first time Mike took me to the facility before I started, and I was able to see the castle, and that's one of those moments where you're like, oh wow. But like I said, you quickly kind of rein yourself in, and you're like, okay, I have a job to do. I feel like I devote so much time to what I do in my work that it's hard for me to really be caught up in it and then to be kind of swayed and to not keep my objectivity.
I guess like when it's a job, you have all those editors, not necessarily keeping you down, but just keeping the guidelines and the structure sounds like it's really important. Mike, I know columnists are different, but do you have kind of instances where you have that experience?
I think everybody has it at the beginning. The first NFL game I ever covered was a Monday night game between the New York Giants, who just won the Super Bowl the year before. They played the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football. And it was my first deadline story. And the Cowboys blew them out. The Giants had lost like 2 or 3 in a row. And I go in the locker room, and the first couple people there are Lawrence Taylor, his uniform, Carl Banks. And all of a sudden, you're like, I got to make this sing. I got to make this story. I got to beat this deadline. But then after you start to get into the flow of it a little bit, and then you start looking at the clock. That clock's always ticking, especially deadlines, always ticking in the back of your head. How much time, that all goes out the window. But when you're young, the first year I covered Major Indoor Soccer League, and we would go out on the road and stay 2 weeks. There was no limited budgets. Whatever was out there on the road you covered sport-wise, that was fun. And at times you sit back, and you should do that. Every young kid who gets this opportunity, because this is a great profession. Come on, I always keep picturing myself saying, hey, I get paid to watch fat men beat each other up on Sundays. That's a pretty good living, all right? But you should sit back and enjoy this, especially when you're younger, because you're flying all around the country. You're watching and writing about guys playing kids' games. I think we all get hit with that. It wears off after a little while, but enjoy it. It's fun. This is a great business we're in.
I totally agree. I may have missed this before, but have you ever had an experience where some of the players that you're covering like come back to you and be like, hey man, I thought we were friends. Why did you do that? Like sort of that division. And this happens, I think, in all areas, not just in sports, but where the source doesn't really recognize that they're a source, they're not your friend. And how do you navigate that? It seems tricky.
Daniel, you want to take that one on before I do?
Well, it's funny because I remember, I wouldn't say that you guys were friends, but I remember one of the first times I was in the Ravens locker room, I introduced myself to Earl Thomas, and he was like, I was like, I'm from the Baltimore Sun. And he was like, oh, I don't mess with you guys. And he was like, your columnist wrote something mean about me a couple of weeks ago about me not practicing. And I was like, oh, I was just joking. I was like, oh, I'll have a talk with him. So, but I think that I'm trying to think. I don't think that's happened to me too much because it's funny. The Ravens have been so good. It's like you almost like haven't been able to write as much negative stuff as usual as like a normal team. But I don't think too often. I think you can tell sometimes when in future interactions when an athlete may have taken offense to, or they may have taken exception to something that you wrote, just in the way they might respond to you, or just kind of answer your question. But like I said, I think at the end of the day, there's an understanding, especially with like the coach John Harbaugh. There's an understanding that you might write something negative about what he says or about the team, but at the end of the day, you have to hit both sides of the coin and be fair in what you're writing and saying.
I think there's a point for all great players that when they get older and they start losing a step, that's when the problems occur, because before then, you're always writing all this positive stuff on them and why they're great players and they're going to the Hall of Fame. And then they lose a step. And people say, you don't lose a step overnight. Yes, you do. It happens. You just wake up the next morning, it's gone. It's done. And they have a tough time realizing that. That it's not all roses anymore. All right, you lost a step. In the NFL, once they find that out, they start picking on you. They start showing you up. And then you have to write about it. And have I lost relationships with that? Yeah. Ray Lewis and I were very tight. And as he got a little older, we don't talk anymore. Tony Saragusa once came up to me and said, "You wrote this great feature story on me when I first came to town, and then all you write about is how bad I am." And I said, "Goose, I really don't know how bad you are. It's just right that you're not the same Tony Saragusa that you used to be." And he goes, "Well, you're not the same guy you used to be 20 years ago." And I said, "I don't play. You play." All right. And he just kind of laughed and kind of, "All right, I got you." And the best thing about it, and I covered that 2000 Super Bowl team, but we had a lot of fights. That was every day. It was fights in a locker room. I mean, just going, and it was good banner, just back and forth. But once they're done playing, I still talk to those guys all the time. I mean, call them up and we just sit around and chew the fat like it's nothing. Again, you build relationships, but with Daniel and this new wave group of journalism, it's different than what I came up with. I prefer my old style. You got to write about the players. When you went out with the players, you didn't write the story. Now if you go out with the players, you are the story. That's the way it works in this business now. But I've had a lot of confrontations. I had one about 2 weeks ago, and that's life. As they said, if you're not getting into those scraps, you're probably not doing your job properly, especially.
Yeah, well, I guess, Mike, as you pointed out with the Tony Siragusa story, yeah, the athletes do eventually lose a step, and yet we as journalists, I think we all tend to think and believe that with every year that we work, we become more polished, more knowledgeable in our profession, and we feel like we don't lose that step,
right?
And I think that's a little bit difference in terms of the career curve of the athlete and the professional journalist. I do want to open this up to questions from our listeners at this point. If anybody's got anything to say, raise your hand, pop up here, and we will get you on and be able to direct your questions directly to Mike and Daniel. Let's see what we get. Anybody?
Actually, I have a question for all of our the people in our Zoom room. Have you guys had experiences where you felt sort of that push-pull in terms of your neutrality or your objectivity that you wanted to kind of bring up and talk about with the guys that are doing this every day and have to really struggle against it? Nobody has any issues or problems on this one?
Well, I was gonna. I know I'm not one of the watchers, but I was gonna say I think if there's any like sports journalists out here like that are in college, I mean, I think that probably comes up a lot. If let's say you're covering a football team or a baseball team or a basketball team, you're writing about your peers a lot in that sense. These are people that you might have classes with, and you might see them walking on campus the next day after you write something negative about them. So I think that, I'm sure if somebody hears a sports journalist, they've kind of faced that. It's the same thing where, you might share the same space as them, be in the same classes as them, but still, you're still doing a job as a college sports reporter, and you have to be objective as well. So, I think that I wouldn't be surprised if any of them have that experience as well.
And I think, I hear it coming up a lot, especially in smaller towns where, you're living, and, most of us live where we work anyway, but in a smaller environment, like you see your county commissioner at the grocery store and they call you out because you had said something, you had written something about that. And so I think these issues and kind of those natural social interactions, like they happen in all beats, not just in sports. This is just such a good example of it. I'm interested. I don't want to call out, I think, is Gwyneth, are you still here? Because I'd love to hear a little bit about what you're doing since you're writing the book on objectivity. Do you have any wisdom to share with us?
Well, I can tell you what I'm up to. I don't want to influence the conversation. What I came here for this morning was to see how journalists in 2021 would be defining objectivity and putting it into practice in their writing. And I thought it was absolutely, I also have taught media ethics from time to time over the years, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating that our two colleagues here would have taken different approaches to the conflict of interest question about going to the picnic at the player's mother's house. And I was thinking to myself, I might just write that up into a case study and use that in the classroom at some point to sort of spark debate. But as far as objectivity goes, what I've been working on, the work that I do, I'm a media historian, and I've been very interested in the way that the mainstream press has engaged issues of diversity over time. And so the book that I wrote was on the history of the newsroom diversity movement. The second book that I am now working on, I discovered that during the 1950s, as the civil rights movement was sort of gaining steam, that there were a number of newspapers that were using objectivity and balance and fairness and accuracy in these journalism standards as ways to control the narrative about race. And my book's under contract with UMass Press, and it was supposed to come out in 2021, and the pandemic had something to say about that. But no, I find this to be very interesting, because I will tell you that when editors, whether they were in the South or whether they were in the North, and I'm talking about white editors at daily newspapers, in the 1950s, as they were dealing with Brown versus Board of Education and trying to figure out how they were going to, at that point, the civil rights movement was still young. They're trying to figure out how to cover and frame the narrative. They were defining objectivity in exactly the same way that you guys were. What I've made notes, you have to hit both sides of the coin and be fair in what you write. You just present, that was from Daniel, then Mike said, you just present the facts, you make it balanced, you give everyone a chance to say what they want to say. Put another date on it. This is sort of a timeless definition of objectivity. And that's what I wanted to see today, was whether or not it's changed. So.
Brian's got something to say.
Actually, just a quick question, because it's something that I've encountered a little bit. In my travels, especially recently, and we've got a pretty good mix of panelists here. So I'll ask the old guy question. In my experience as a reporter, I mean, one of the things that I was always taught was you don't donate to campaigns, you don't get involved, you don't go to marches, you don't go to rallies, you don't get involved in taking opinions, especially on hot button issues. And I feel maybe there's a shift here, and I don't know if it's generational or if it's social media driven, as so much is these days. But I encounter a lot of especially younger reporters who are very open about the fact that they feel very entitled in taking positions on issues, testifying on bills, staking out positions on social media, especially on hot button issues. And I'm just interested in getting a sense from everybody if this is in fact changing, what's driving it, and if it is or isn't changing, is that necessarily a good thing for the profession? Oh, and by the way, kids, I will just tell you, never ask 3 questions in one question like I just did. Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, I guess I'll tackle that first, just because I have a unique experience, because during the pandemic, when there was no sports, I shifted to like the metro side, so I was covering these protests and just everything non-sports. I was on it for most of 2020 before football came back, and I kind of found myself wrestling with that as we start to see the nationwide protests. I think me personally, I'm someone that doesn't necessarily get on Twitter just kind of like spew all my opinions. I think that you just by generally following me, you can kind of see where I stand. But I would say I think that it is kind of a generational thing. I think it is a younger journalists and just people throughout the country who feel strongly about their beliefs, who are passionate about these things, and in many cases for journalists, I think in the past there was this notion that that you had to kind of be mum on certain issues at all, and you couldn't speak on anything or else you weren't objective. But especially in the case of like Black journalists and journalists from underrepresented backgrounds, to kind of not speak on some of these things, or to at least educate people on these things, would be to kind of silence yourself and your identity. So obviously I'm not, like, for example, I'm not gonna get on Twitter and say I hate so and so, I hate this politician, I hate this group or whatever. But there but to not speak about injustices would almost be like a disservice, just because you're speaking out against something that's kind of blatantly wrong doesn't mean that you don't have objectivity, or doesn't mean that you can't report on something fair with a fair and balanced mind. And to kind of go back and to talk about like kind of the definitions that we were given. Yeah, you want to of objectivity. Yeah, you want to hit both sides of the coin, but if one side is saying something that's blatantly false, you have a duty and an obligation to make sure that that's known. You can't just report. That's what I was saying before. You can't just report what somebody says and take it as fact. So I hope I answered all aspects. But yeah, I think that there is a growing, a kind of a new generation, a new group of young people, of young journalists who don't want to be kind of barred and locked down by the kind of the old fashioned and archaic definition of objectivity, that meant you can't speak out against stuff at all that's kind of like blatantly in your face.
Daniel, it almost sounds like you are seeing a division between like you as journalist and you as person. And so you can, in your private life, speak out in a way that I think there's a cohort of journalists who are like, I have to be totally invisible as a person to be able to do my job right. Am I getting that?
Yeah, in
Right?
a sense. Yeah, in a sense. And the thing is, I don't think you necessarily have to be invisible. I think the one important thing is not to become the story. With whatever you say, you don't want to take over it and make the issue about you. So we can speak about, police brutality, and voter suppression and whatnot, and not necessarily make the story about us and about our views, but kind of speak out against stuff that's kind of blatantly out there. In the past, I think that that was something that was kind of frowned upon in a sense. And I think that, I think it's good for journalism in a sense, because I think that I think that increasingly we're seeing, especially amongst younger journalists, they're not always taking what elected officials and people in power say, at face value. They're questioning it. They are asking why and going deeper on the surface. And I think that the fact that we're starting not to tell people to kind of suppress their identity and to remain invisible. I think that that's a reason why we're seeing this.
Thanks. Mike, do you have anything else to add? And then Gwyneth, I know you had your hand up earlier.
But I think when I first got into this business, we were pretty old school and we didn't participate. I think one of the best things the Sun does now, and I didn't at the time, was they have these disclosure forms that you have to fill out to say, what groups do you belong to? What do you participate in? So they know, so they don't get blindsided. So they give you some of that leeway. And if there's a red flag on there, they will call you up and discuss the situation. which I like, because you really shouldn't blindside your boss. And there's protest and you're out there on the street and they're focusing on you because we are celebrities in a sense. We have become the story. I like that, but there is more room for journalists to get involved, community-wise, activist-wise, and that just shows that we are human beings. We are people too, and we have a lot of interests other than just doing their job.
Mhm.
Well, and just to piggyback on what Mike said, I mean, I'm really glad to hear that the Sun does that, because I think that the ground is shifting in this area. And for better or for worse, I have to tell you, I'm not completely comfortable with it, but the most, like, my career, I covered a lot of government and politics before I got into editing. I never made a campaign contribution. I never attended a fundraiser without paying my own way. I made my first political contribution after I retired. I never had a political lawn sign in my yard until after I retired. Never had a bumper sticker on my car. I mean, that's kind of the way that those were the norms that were in effect for a lot of us as we came through. And I think as we go through this period of transition, it's really important for newspapers to have policies and to have discussions with their people, because literally something may happen tomorrow that's going to change the prevailing thought within your newsroom, because
Right.
this was said or that was said. And so you've got to stay on top of that stuff. And the best way to do it is to have the kind of discussions that Mike was talking about. So I'm really glad that that's happening. Where exactly we're going to end up, I'm not sure, but it can only be done it needs to be done with very careful, open discussion, and then disseminating that to the entire staff, so everybody will know, oh, this is the new policy. It didn't used to be this way, but now they don't want us to do this, or now we're free to do that, or this example is bad. So that needs to be part of the change in newsrooms, that openness and transparency and discussion.
I agree.
Gwyneth, did you have something?
Oh, go ahead, Larry. Were you going to say
I
something?
was just, did Gwyneth want to add something? I know she had her hand up earlier.
I did, and I took it down because Daniel made my point. He said that journalists have an obligation to point out when something is factually inaccurate. And there has, I've noticed a shift in the way that the news media are covering politics in particular of late, where things are said by officials and they are not, they're provably false. And there seems to be a position that we no longer just reproduce that and without challenging it. And Daniel made that point. So.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? I know we're at 10:21, so we're right in our time where we were going to wrap up, but happy to have any more comments or questions from the group. All right. Well then, with that, Mike and Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. I think this has been a terrific discussion and given us all food for thought.
Thank you from me too.
Alrighty, hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Great job, guys. We appreciate it.
Really good.
Right.
Absolutely. And so our next, as you all may know, this was part of our Into the Newsroom series. So every week we have panelists come on to talk about the ways that we can get better as journalists and build skills. Our next session coming up is covering the Black community. We may need to reschedule that. It's set for next Tuesday, and we're just having some scheduling conflicts with our presenters. So that will be coming up, and then the following week, Larry, what's on tap?
The following week will be, well, that'll be 2 weeks from today, and it's going to be interviewing techniques, and the presenters will be Tom Linthicum, as well as Andy West from the Delaware State News and yours truly. So we will have a little bit of a three-way conversation, and we'll probably try to ask each other some leading questions and show the interns and others who are listening in some of the better techniques to go about getting the best out of your interview. So that's what's on the plate for 2 weeks from today.
Terrific. And so our sessions go all the way through August. They're open to everyone and free of charge. This, as you know, has been recorded. And so this, as well as all of our other Into the Newsroom sessions, are on MDDC's YouTube channel. And registration is for our Into the Newsroom sessions is sort of the top line story at mddcpress.com. So I invite you to do that. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.